Call 911 now. She's turning blue. The words cut through the hush of the glass-walled boardroom like a thrown stone. A hand went for the lectern. Papers fluttered. Somewhere beyond the panes, the city's din continued. A bus braking, a siren receding. Inside, time narrowed to the sound of a woman's breath that wasn't breathing. Bernard James Kellerman had been sweeping for 40 minutes when the room convulsed. He had been on a ladder, polishing a chrome railing, listening to the CEO's keynote through the thin ceiling of the conference area. He was supposed to be invisible, background noise in a place that polished its own reflections. That was the work. Be present, be clean, be efficient, then vanish. He dropped the ladder and ran. He reached Alexandra Ashcroft sprawled between two swivel chairs, the color draining from her face so fast it seemed to lift the light. Her hand lay slack. A half-finished sentence hung on the air, an accolade lost in the sudden stillness. People moved in autopilot, cell phones out, fingers hovering, but no one did what needed to be done. Bernard did. He rolled Alexandra onto her back, checked for a pulse with the practiced impatience of someone who'd learned emergency habits in a dozen cheap apartments and a community center where he had volunteered CPR classes. He tilted her head, pinched her nose, sealed his mouth over hers, and breathed. He compressed. The boardroom echoes watched in stunned silence as a janitor, calloused, plain, smelling faintly of floor wax, pressed life back into a woman the planet had learned to take seriously. The CPR was methodical because Bernard had to be methodical. Molly's small chest had taught him the mechanics. 2 rescue breaths, 30 compressions, stay with it until help arrived. He had practiced on a mannequin that had once belonged to a church youth program, and on nights when his landlord's daughter choked on a grape and he'd been the only one calm enough to remember how to compress a ribcage. It wasn't heroics as much as muscle memory, an economy of motion carved by necessity. The first gasp she drew was a sound somewhere between a blessing and a breaking. Alexandra's face flushed, her eyes fluttered, and then, met with a collective, uncoordinated exhale, the room exhaled. For a heartbeat, relief hung like a slow dawn. Then the boardroom caught its breath in a different way. Someone stepped back as if Bernard's proximity had polluted the air. An executive hand lifted, soft and official. Security, HR. People in suits muttered into their wrists. The photographer who had been preparing to take a triumphant photographer paused, phone raised, indecision frozen on his face. He was a janitor. He had touched the CEO. There are rules to optics in places like that. Staged admiration, controlled access, curated vulnerability. A man who lives in the margins of corporate landscaping had breached the polished membrane.
The gasp of relief shifted. People began to perceive the scene not as a rescue, but as an exposure. In that instant, for a room practiced in reading the world as potential liability, Bernard ceased to be a man who had saved a life and became instead a problem to be managed. Security. Escort him out, someone whispered. It was a phrase that belonged to a world where appearances mattered more than truth. Bernard let the paramedics take over. He kept his hands where they were when the lead medic asked him his name, because names meant you knew what happened, and sometimes a name let the world judge you. In the hallway, fluorescent light flattened faces into paper cutouts. 2 security guards closed in with the careful aggression of people trained to make doors appear where they were not supposed to. Bernard felt the weight of dozens of eyes, not grateful, but suspicious. His palms were damp with sweat and with the faint scent of bleach. "Sir, you need to step aside," one guard said. "We need a statement." "I did what I was supposed to do," Bernard said. His voice was low. It did not carry across the echoing marble. She wasn't breathing. You touched an executive inappropriately," another voice said, quieter but more precise. It tasted like policy language. HR will need to review. Someone took their phone and began to film. Someone else had already called the press office. In situations like that, the machinery of corporate self-preservation moved faster than the moral sense of those involved. It was easier to categorize, to label, to decide. By the time the paramedics wheeled Alexandra away, Bernard stood with a security guard by the elevator, his cleaning cart a pathetic sentinel to his presence. He watched the doors close and the building swallow its own crisis. He thought of Molly, of the yellow scribbles on her refrigerator that spelled out they could make rent if he worked a double shift this week. He thought of the sealed folder in his head, the one that contained a history he had spent years trying not to have define him. He thought of calling Janet to say, "She's okay," and then realized he didn't know if that would help. Nobody in the elevator thanked him. One executive gave him a look of practiced discomfort, the kind that said, "Keep your distance." The janitor in the mirror of the elevator door looked like a man who had done the simplest thing and had been punished for it. Inside HR, the decision moved at the speed of liability. A risk manager pulled up surveillance footage. The credentials of the janitor, Bernard James Kellerman, employee ID, last promotion recorded as none, were cross-referenced with the company's expectations of appropriate conduct. A lawyer leaned in and explained the optics, late-night coverage, cameras, a world that would interpret proximity as something else if you let rumors fill the space.
Someone mentioned social media as if it were some independent hurricane already forming over the Atlantic. By sundown, a terse email hit Bernard's inbox, formal, devoid of empathy, labeled termination for cause. There was a line about inappropriate physical contact and a promise of a full review, which in corporate shorthand often meant the review had already been concluded. Attached was the HR report, procedural language, bullet points, the kind of documentation that gives institutional decisions the sterile sheen of inevitability. He took the elevator down alone. People in algorithmically curated suits averted their eyes. Someone muttered, "Unfortunate," and meant necessary. Two janitor colleagues slid close and mouthed, "You okay?" He nodded, an automatic gesture that didn't express the scramble of fear in his ribs. Outside, the city had not paused. A child on a scooter carved a line between trembling adults. The temperature dropped fast. The winter was not yet deep, but it had teeth. Bernard walked home with his cart, hands in his pockets, thinking of the notice he had to pay at Spencer & Cole Realty on Friday. He could picture the red stamp that would come if he missed it. Tenant notice. On the sidewalk, a stranger's thumb swiped across a screen, and the world changed shape. The man who had filmed the hallway had uploaded a grainy clip to a private messaging app. Someone else trimmed it, added a headline that it had been leaked, posted a still of Bernard bent over Alexandra with an insinuating caption that asked fewer questions than it invited outrage. The image was cropped to exclude the paramedic hands, the oxygen mask, the compression rhythm. In that frame, context went missing. In the internet, the kind that ran on assumption and appetite, began to gossip. At home, Bernard opened the door to a small apartment that seemed to remember better times. The walls were painted an off-white that never quite brightened. There were jars in the kitchen with mismatched spoons. Molly, 7, had a crown of hair that resisted brushes, in a shirt with a cartoon fox. She looked up from her homework with an expression that was half relief and half reading her father for news. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," he lied, setting down the cart. "Just tired." Janet Holloway was in the living room on her folding chair, a neighbor who'd been more family than acquaintance. She knitted without looking at the needles, practice built from years of small community caregiving. Her phone was on her lap. There were 2 missed calls and a terse text from the landlord about conditions of lease. Janet's eyes, the kind that had seen every bright and broken moment in the block, held a question. "You did the right thing, Bernard," she said. Her voice was steady, but Bernard could see the worry behind it. "You helped a lady." "Helped," I repeated, and the word tasted thin.
He tried to explain when the first rumors arrived in the form of notifications, a neighbor's forwarded link, 2 unfamiliar numbers on his phone, a private message from a friend who asked bluntly if he had lost his mind. The loop of panic unfurled quicker outside than the story could be corrected inside a corporate press release. "People are cruel, baby," Janet said. "They'll take anything and make it worse." Molly didn't understand the contours of the accusation. She only knew that Daddy's phone buzzed, and he frowned, and that Daddy spoke to the landlord the next day, and that bills were more urgent than they had been last month. That week's rent was the size of a mountain. Bernard had scraped together enough by taking extra shifts, nights at the office tower, early mornings at the supermarket. The termination email was a small document with big teeth. The image in the message thread had a caption that read, "Alleged harassment during closed-door board meeting." People added commentary in the way people do, quick, slicing, certain. A man at the bakery called Bernard a pervert into a line where no one else could hear. A former coworker posted on an anonymous forum that the company had always had a safety problem with low-level contractors. The rumor machine smelled blood and amplified it. In the days after, Bernard felt the world recoil. On the job sites where he used to be hired for cleaning gigs, phone calls once easy to make were mired in sudden hesitations. "We can't risk it," a woman at a private school said when he tried to follow up for substitute janitor work. "There's been complications." He sat in Denny's for a whole Sunday, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and watched his reflection in the window as people walked by with their certainty like armor. He tried to reach HR. He reached voicemail and a polite representative who read from a prepared script about investigations and "we respect due process" and We assure all parties a confidential review. The language was measured. It didn't touch him where it ached. In a legal briefing room, tones and protocols might be the best tools against chaos. Here on the corner of Vine and 3rd, legalese was a distant planet. At night, Bernard lay awake listening to a small clock tick and Molly breathing in the next room. He had a sealed record from before Molly, one of those things from a life that had once been loud and bad and then shut behind courthouse doors. The record had been sealed when he turned 18, a final act the system offered to a boy who stumbled. That seal had been his last chance to be judged only on the man he had become, not on the boy he once was. In a world that liked neat narratives, the seal was a loophole. He had never told Molly. He had never told Janet. It was a book he carried, closed, and the thought of someone prying it open made his throat close. The smear campaign, because that was what it was, didn't need to be elaborate.
It only needed to be louder than the truth. A blog with a small but angry readership posted the still in a speculative headline. A local influencer resharing with a snide caption. Someone dug up an old misdemeanor that had been expunged but was accessible if you knew where to look. It was presented without context, a bloodless dossier that hinted at danger. Tyler Brigham, chief financial officer, saw opportunity in those murmurs. Tyler had a face that was always half apologetic and fully defended. He knew how to turn misfortune into risk mitigation. He had been the one in the meeting to suggest the company's optics needed a rapid remediation. It's not about guilt or innocence, he told the CEO's chief of staff over coffee, cold and efficient. It's about perception. If the public imagines misconduct, we lose trust, we lose investors, we lose markets. This is not a social ethics debate. This is fiscal survival. He'd instructed the communications team to prepare a statement that framed the incident as an inappropriate breach of protocol. The word choice was tidy and impersonal. When the first phone calls about evicting them came, the landlord spoke with the certainty of someone expecting to be paid. He had a ledger. He had a life that relied on rent arriving every first of the month. Bernard argued, scraped, tried to offer an IOU. The human kindness that had once been part of the neighborhood felt frayed. Molly watched all of this with a child's acute antennae. She didn't understand the legal constructs that were being used against her father, but she felt the atmosphere thicken. At school, a boy asked where her father worked. At a big building, she said, shy pride running through her voice. When other children's parents whispered and their faces changed, her pride dimmed. The grave morphological shift of being judged on a single misread frame made Bernard feel like a ghost at his own life. He could see the edges of a future where he and Molly were living under a tarp, where his name would carry a stain that would chase them through small-town fairs and job applications. He found himself talking less, using his lands less, avoiding mirrors. Meanwhile, the person in those images, the woman who had nearly died, woke covered in sweat. Alexandra Ashcroft's life had been a study in upgrade. She moved through spaces that recognized her worth because she carried value like a cloak, capital, reputation, influence. When she came to from the compression, she felt the weight of a sudden vacancy and then shreds of a hand under her cheek. She remembered a calloused palm, the smell of floor cleaner, a crouched figure pushing air back into her lungs. She had rehearsed being saved only in stage settings, photographers poised, a PR team ready to choreograph meaning. Sitting up in a private recovery room, a nurse checked charts and offered water and a blanket.
Alexandra's first coherent thought was not about the speech she had been giving, but about the man who'd saved her. She asked for him by name, as if the name might be an assurance the world hadn't already rewritten him into a suspect. Her assistant explained in clipped tones that a member of facilities had been moved out and that HR had addressed the incident. The word hit Alexandra like a cold draft. She asked the assistant for the footage. He hesitated, not because he didn't have access, but because someone, Tyler likely, had already begun to articulate that this was a problem of optics. "There's a version of events we need to protect," Tyler had said the morning of the incident, voice small and legalistic. "We can't allow misinterpretation to proliferate." Alexandra watched the surveillance footage in the dim of her office that evening, alone, the glow of a monitor painting the room bluish. The image was grainy black and white, time-stamped with the corporate network signature. At first, she watched from the perspective of a figure meeting a technical document, timestamps, camera angles. Then she watched as the footage focused, and she saw his face, Bernard's face, clearer than the PR memos would permit. He was breathing with her mouth, compressing with a rhythm that looked nothing like predation. He didn't pause to glance at cameras. He didn't perform for the room. He acted like someone who had no script and no audience.
As she rewound and watched again, seeing the paramedics take over, she felt something else, a small electric shock of shame. She'd heard the HR briefing, had accepted the phrase inappropriate contact as administrative neutral. She had watched the email confirming his termination float through the company's channels later on her phone. It had been placed, she'd assumed, for the comfort of investors, for the stability of the balance sheet. She had thought little of the janitor's life beyond that moment because she had always lived in places that simplified human complexity into quarterly results. Now, alone with the footage, the simplifications folded. The camera didn't lie. It simply recorded contextless frames that required context to make sense. She saw Molly's father salvage a life and then watched the same images recut by people who wanted different meanings. Alexandra removed the blanket from her shoulders and felt suddenly very cold. Her first instinct was private. Find him, say thank you. Her second instinct was judicial. Instruct legal to reverse the termination. Her third, quieter one, the one that made her lungs tighten, was that a man who had saved her could not be allowed to be broken by his act of care. She stepped away from the monitor and dialed a number that reached Tyler straight away. His voice was practiced, ready for the pivot. "What's your call?" he asked. "He was fired," Alexandra said. A pause. "Yes," Tyler said, officious. "We had to protect the company." "From what?"
she asked, and the sound of the question in her own ears surprised her. The words were more than curiosity. They were a nascent verdict. "From a man who saved my life?" In the line after that, Tyler said the kind of sentence you hear when institutions make fearful choices. "We have to consider precedent. If we appear lenient, we invite risk. It's not about him. It's about optics." Alexandra looked at the grainy footage again and saw him, sweat-soaked and intent, save someone with a desperate calm. She thought of the phrase, optics, and how easily it bent moral clarity into a boardroom decision. She imagined Bernard walking home with the same cart he had, picturing his little kitchen, his child waiting, the notice for rent burning in his pocket like a match. She felt a thin thread of guilt wind tight inside her like a wire. "What did HR do?" she asked. "Protocol," Tyler said. "We acted." She didn't hang up. Instead, she cued the replay and watched the entire clip, again and then again, until the room blurred into a single action's persistence. She could see the paramedics approach, could see her own hand reach for towels, as if she were watching an awkward mannequin theater. There was no flourish, no pause for applause. There was only a man who knew how to keep a child alive, and who had done the same for a stranger in a suit. When she finally stood, Alexandra felt something shift that had nothing to do with corporate arithmetic. It was a private responsibility, messy and personal. She called her executive assistant. "Find me his name. Find me his address. Call facilities. Call Janet Holloway. If that name existed in the site records, pull everything." She wanted to know who the man was, not for a press quote, but because she could not look at a life saved and then at a life destroyed without intervening. That night, as the city leaned into the next day's headlines, Bernard sat at his kitchen table and watched his phone light up with messages he didn't want to answer. He had been dismissed in a single sentence and rendered fragile. Anxiety felt like a live thing under his ribs, something he could almost, but not quite, smother with sleep. He knew the sealed record could be found. He knew what a corporate legal team could do with a line from an old file. That dread sank deep. He called Molly to the table and tried to make eggs, but his hands trembled. Molly said nothing about the image she'd seen on a neighbor's tablet. Children find ways to shoulder-grown things and still be small. Bernard wanted to be a fortress. He was a man of small bricks. The next morning, an envelope arrived at their building marked with the landlord's brand. The notice was plain, a request for immediate payment or vacate. It didn't need to explain. The paper was its own verdict. Janet read it over and closed her eyes. She had been steady in the face of emergencies before, but there was a new edge to this one.
Across town, Alexandra's assistant sent a short note with an address. She read it and felt everything accelerate. Bernard's name was confirmed. There were sketches of his life, a string of part-time positions listed on a municipal contractor roster, a volunteer certificate for CPR training from a community center, a civic-minded letter from the church where he had once taught youth. There was also a line in small print that mentioned a youth adjudication decades earlier. Sealed records, the assistant annotated, but accessible to those who know where to look. Alexandra sat with the information as if it were fragile glass. She could feel the shape of a decision forming. Speak up publicly.
dispatch lawyers to reverse the termination, offer something to ensure the man who had saved her could be whole. But she also understood, in the granular way a person with power does, that action would ripple. For every step she took, Tyler and the legal team would have to be managed. The optics she despised would have to be controlled again, albeit for a different narrative. She could redeem a life. She could also be read as playing savior. She thought of a line she had once heard in a younger boardroom. Power without responsibility is just an illusion. It felt truer now, more urgent. If she wanted to be a leader who mattered, it was not enough to give a statement. It would require resources, legal muscle, and the more awkward work of undoing a smear. It would require that she put the company's balance sheet at risk to put a man's life back on track. Her fingers hovered over the phone. Outside, city lights blinked like distant watchful eyes. The surveillance footage, still paused on the monitor, seemed to remind her that the difference between being seen and being misread could be measured in frames. Meanwhile, Bernard paced the small apartment and watched local forums and comment threads fill up with embellishments. Someone had tacked his photograph to a bulletin board of rumor. The sealed juvenile record, the rumor of inappropriate behavior. These were narratives that could be weaponized by people who wanted to punish first and listen later. He thought about the notation in his HR file that suggested sensitivity training for contractors, as if such a thing could stitch back the slow tearing off the seams of his life. He called a lawyer who offered to consult for a fee they could not afford. He thought about the city shelter policies he once read when confronting an eviction in a friend's life. He pictured himself and Molly in a temporary bed, the uncertainty compressing his chest like a hand. The fear that had been only theoretical in the back of his mind now had a name and an email thread and a headline. On a gray afternoon, an anonymous account posted a cropped screenshot of the CCTV footage with a suggestive caption and the tagline that the rich had the right to protection from low-level contractors. The post gathered heat.
Neighbors looked up from their doors as if a neighborhood tribunal had come to accusation. The bakery boy refused to accept his early morning shift when he learned who had been fired. A man who used to be a friend waved as if to say, "Sorry, not now." When the knock came at the door that evening, Bernard answered, expecting the landlord. Instead, it was Alexandra's executive assistant, a well-dressed woman who had been driving the curator's logic of damage control all week. She was not there for him with a press release. She was there with a question. "Miss Ashcroft asked me to find you," the assistant said. "She wants to say thank you." Bernard's hand went numb on the doorknob. The phrase landed oddly in a house that smelled of coffee and bleach. He had never expected gratitude to come wrapped in a tie. "Tell her thanks," he said. He closed the door. That night, Bernard slept badly. The panic felt like cold water under the ribs. He thought about the choices ahead. Fight a legal designation he could not afford to contest, or accept silence and vanish until the rumor faded. He understood the brutal arithmetic of the world. Resources beget power. Power shields you from consequences. Without it, you are exposed. Alexandra, awake in her high-rise, did not sleep either. The footage had become a compass. She had an image on the screen and a name on a file, and with both came a responsibility she could not outsource. She made a list that was practical and immediate. Call legal, rescind termination, arrange payment for rent, check his medical records, was he physically okay, and find a way to counter the smear. She knew there would be resistance. Corporations do not undo decisions lightly. Tyler would not cede ground easily. But she had watched a man act without calculation. She had felt the raw, unrefined power of a solitary life-saving action that no boardroom had authorized. She did not yet know where she would find him. She did not yet know how she would unspool the public narrative. She did not know if the man would accept help. But she felt the pull of something that required immediate motion. Outside, Molly slept, unaware that her father's name had been dragged through feeds and comments, and that strangers had decided what kind of man he was. Inside the apartment, a small cardboard box of survival supplies stood waiting. Spare toiletries, canned beans, a thermos, things Bernard had assembled in the belief that the world could shift under his feet. He had always prepared for storms of the literal kind. He had not expected the weather of rumor. In the morning, an email thread at Ashcroft Enterprises began to form. Legal memos, PR drafts, Tyler's cautions, Alexandra's insistence. The company's name would soon be attached to a decision either reparative or defensive. The choice would set a precedent. The choice would be watched. Bernard crossed the street toward the bus stop and felt each footfall as a small rebellion against the gravity of fear.
He thought of Molly's laugh, the rhythm of the days that had made him patient in the ways that mattered. He told himself to breathe. He remembered the steadiness of his hands when they were needed, and how sometimes courage looked like simply showing up. He paused at a newsstand where a magazine had a headline alluding to the incident without naming him. The photograph was cropped to obscure context. The words beneath it leaned toward scandal. He swallowed bile and walked away. Alexandra sat on the edge of her bed and pressed the screen of her phone. She called Janet Holloway because an address had been scribbled on a sticky note, and because the woman had a neighbor's bluntness that ignored corporate niceties. Janet answered by saying simply, "Bernard, he's here." The admission felt like a hinge. Somewhere, the arc of action tilted. Somebody on a higher plane had recognized a single human life that needed attention. But the world is a patient jury. One person's interest does not undo weeks of rumor, or the small procedural language that had already decided him guilty in the eyes of some. Alexandra booked a car. She told no one the reason, except to ask that the record be pulled and the termination set aside pending review. Tyler sent an email about calming narratives. Legal prepared a soft reversal. PR drafted a neutral statement. There were lawyers and memos and the arithmetic of options. The machinery began to move, but motion is not repair. Bernard, meanwhile, sat on his stoop with Molly's homework lying on his lap. He did not yet know that a woman whose life he had saved was deciding whether to save his in return. He only knew the cold of the city's indifferent light, and the sense that everything he had worked to protect could be swept away. He had never claimed to be anything other than a man who loved his daughter and would give what he had to keep her warm. He did not expect pity. He did not want charity that would gin up a headline. He wanted to be seen accurately and to be allowed to live. That had been the quiet labor of his adulthood, to stitch what had been torn, and to teach Molly that repair was possible without pretending nothing had broken. As Alexandra's driver threaded the city's arteries toward a low-rise block she had passed a dozen times and never seen for the lives inside it, she thought about an image she had not heard since childhood. A chair pulled up to a table, a place set. She wanted Bernard to have a seat at some table that mattered. She did not yet know where that table would be, or if he would accept the invitation. On a nearby street, someone with a phone recorded a man be denied at a shop and added a caption that fed the rumor. The stream of hostility crawled toward the apartment towers like a slow, inevitable current. The courage of one moment, Bernard's decision to act, met the hunger of 1,000 small judgments hungry to be fed. The collision promised a fallout that could shatter more than one life.
Inside, Bernard folded Molly's homework into a neat stack. He put on his coat. He told her they would be all right. The words were not a guarantee. They were a covenant he had to try to keep. From the corner of a private car, Alexandra watched the city through glass with the same concentration she had watched the footage. She thought of the ripple effects of small things, how a hand on a chest could generate 1,000 questions, how a recorded frame could be retold until it became a story no longer resembling the truth. She stepped out of the car with a single private intention, to find the man who had saved her and to ask him a question that storage room power could not answer. Not, how do we manage the optics, she would not ask. Not, how do we reverse the PR, but simply, are you okay? Her feet carried her toward an apartment building that smelled of dinners gone by and laundry left over on a sill. On the stoop, Bernard looked up as she approached, and for a moment, both of them held the shape of an entire collision. A life saved, a life endangered, a city's judgment. She said quietly, "You saved my life." He heard the words and felt the weight of them, not as absolution, but as the beginning of something else. The world had already turned its verdict. The phrase was a small light in a room that was mostly shadows. He did not yet know whether that light would grow into shelter, or whether it would be used as a backdrop for a new photograph that would be cropped and misconstrued. Behind them, the smear did its quiet, insistent work. Screens glowed, fingers typed. A man named Tyler coordinated messaging with an efficiency that made repulsion anonymous. The first legal memos had left the firm's server. A leak here, a private blogger there. The architecture of rumor was being built, while two people stood under a dull porch light and tried to decide what to do next. Bernard's hands found Alexandra's in a gesture that was not theatrical, but honest. He did not expect grand gestures. He expected clarity and accountability.
He expected to be seen and allowed to be whole without being a story. She looked at him and said what she had already recorded privately in the thick of her own conscience. "You're not invisible anymore." He let the words land, half gratitude and half demand. Outside, a world impatient for spectacle leaned in. Inside, two people who had shared a moment of vulnerability began the slow and uncertain business of reassembling truth in a place where a single frame had already done so much damage. If you want to follow Bernard's full story and see the truth behind the smear, subscribe. The words are small but precise, an invitation, not a plea, and they hang between the stoop light and the hum of the street as Alexandra's car idles 2 doors down. She looks at him the way someone looks at a broken thing they're about to try to fix. He looks at her the way a man looks at a woman who has just told him he is visible.
They do not speak for a long moment. The air between them is full of other people's words. A siren wails somewhere far off. Molly's hand is warm in his. Janet stands just behind him, knuckles white on a canvas tote, the neighborhood's patient sentinel. Alexandra starts and stops. She is used to being able to finish sentences for other people. This is not one of those moments. "You saved my life," she says again, plain as a thing spelled on a board. No speechwriters, no hedged clauses, just the fact. He could have laughed. He could have turned the phrase into something small. Instead, he nodded. He felt the weight the sentence carried, the potential and the demand lodged inside it. "I was fired," Bernard said. It wasn't a question. He did not want to explain the mechanics of a corporate email and how fast an institution could decide somebody's fate. He wanted only the facts to be known. Alexandra's face closed for a second, in a way that looked less like annoyance than it did like someone discovering a new map. "Then I'll fix that," she said. It was not a promise of magic. It was a promise of motion. The first thing she did, practical, immediate, was call for an ambulance. Bernard had been walking on a razor's edge of adrenaline and shock since the boardroom. The press of weeks had begun to show. Sleeplessness, shallow breathing, a tremor that lived under his skin. She had been wealthy enough to charter flights and buy companies. In the stairwell of a low-rise neighborhood block, she practiced a different kind of power, deciding to spend her money on someone else's survival before she worried about headlines. The paramedics arrived within minutes because someone in a private car had made a phone call that cut through priority lines. A private medical center agreed to receive him. Alexandra signed forms with her name as guarantor, as if legal oxygen could be purchased and gifted. In the ambulance, he smelled of the day, wheel solvent, fried food, the faint metallic tang of a city. He told the medics he felt dizzy, his words small and careful. Blood pressure rose and fell. They wrapped a blanket around him, not for warmth alone, but for the human comfort of being treated like someone with a body worth saving without debate. At the hospital, a register nurse took his vitals while a social worker asked the questions that split into 2 tracks, the immediate medical assessment and the ancillary one, housing, food, safety. The private wing smelled of lemon disinfectant and soft upholstery. Alexandra did not leave his side. She looked at the technicians the way she had once looked at consultants, direct, decisive, until a bed was found and a team began to stitch his body back into its ordinary contours. Bernard woke to a fluorescent white and someone rubbing his hand with a rough, insistent kindness. He blinked at the ceiling, then at Alexandra's shoes. She was not performing.
Her eyes were red at the rims, the kind of redness that suggested she had been awake for too long, and had sat in the cold company of her own conscience. "Everyone is safe," she told him. "You're safe." He laughed once, short and without humor. "I never thought saving somebody would make people want to take my name away." She looked at him hard. That should never happen. Her intervention did not stop at a scene of triage. She moved with a lawyer's efficiency and a neighbor's bluntness. She told a fleet of people, legal, HR, PR, that the termination would be rescinded immediately, pending a full review. She instructed the company to prepare a notarized statement acknowledging the facts on the footage, and to put out a public note clarifying that a facilities worker had performed life-saving CPR. She authorized funds to cover rent arrears, immediate living support, and a temporary private housing option for Bernard, Molly, and Janet, until they could secure stable housing. She signed off on grief counseling, a temporary stipend for missed wages, and a medical bill cover for care that the hospital had already agreed to render.
Bernard sat and watched as a city of resources recalibrated around him. He could see Tyler's name on one of the memos that flicked across a screen in the back room. Tyler had been given options: damage control, narrative containment, avoidance of investor panic. Alexandra personally overruled the language that would reduce a person into a problem. "We will not frame this as a liability," she said, setting her jaw as though setting a foundation stone. "We will call it what it is, an act of life-saving. We will repair the harm that followed." On the other end of the phone, Tyler's voice was cool. "Miss Ashcroft, we can mitigate reputational loss." "By ruining his life?" she interrupted. The question was rhetorical, but it carried a quiet force that made the legal counsel in the room shift. He had been, the staff later admitted, trying to preserve an institutional impression of control. He had been thinking in spreadsheets and risk matrices. Alexandra had been thinking in human terms, maybe because she had once been taught to see everything as an asset, but now she saw that some assets were not numbers but people. Word spread that the company had reversed course. The press office sent a statement that was neutral, then one that was more human. Alexandra insisted they include the surveillance footage appended as evidence, uncut, with timestamps and accompanying narration by a neutral auditor, so the public could see the context for themselves. It was a risky move in the world of public relations. Releasing unedited footage can cut either way, but Alexandra had decided that the truth, messy and inconvenient, was a better anchor than any spun narrative. The internet does not tend to reciprocate leaps of conscience immediately. The smear had already seeded commentary and a few virulent posts.
When the uncut footage went public, two things happened almost at once. Many people were forced to revise their initial assumptions. Others dug deeper, searching for dirt to confirm their first impressions. An old pattern: sealed records are salacious. They invite curiosity, reignited. Someone, a private blogger with a small following, hungry for clicks, posted a story that claimed the company had been hiding Bernard's past for weeks. The headline shouted, "Sealed juvenile record raises questions." Beneath the headline, the blog reproduced redacted pages and offered innuendo as if it were evidence. It did not provide legal analysis. It did not, crucially, explain the protective purpose of sealed records. It existed to create outrage. Alexandra learned of the post by watching the analytics spike on the PR dashboard. She watched Bernard, already fragile, see the article on his phone when a neighbor forwarded it to him. He was sitting on the hospital bed, Molly at his side with a small stuffed rabbit clenched between her knees. He read with his throat working. He had fought his whole life for the opportunity to be judged on the man he had become, rather than the boy he had once been. The blog did not respect that silence. The blog wanted a story. This is where institutional power can either be used to further wound or to protect. Alexandra chose protection. She had her legal team issue a cease and desist to the blogger and the hosting platform. That alone would not be enough. Public discourse moves faster than court notices. So she did something quieter and more effective. She notarized a statement acknowledging the footage and clarifying the context of the record. It was sealed, and the sealed status was legally significant. She authorized the company to fund a small legal defense for Bernard to address the misuse of the sealed material. She did not call the attention to the past as a salve. She called for the past to be respected as the law had intended. The company also sent a formal demand to any employees found to have leaked internal documents, and an internal audit began into who had accessed sealed files and why. The audit revealed a pattern of careless access. No smoking gun of a conspiracy, no dramatic backstage coup. But it did reveal that Tyler's team had circulated talking points and had explicitly asked for any context that could be used to defend the company's initial move. In the messy circulation of talking points and private messages, someone had pushed a redacted file upward into a channel it should never have been in. Tyler had not, at first, typed the blog post. He had laid a path, though, and the path had been trodden by people who wanted a tidy narrative. When confronted about it, Tyler folded in the way people fold when cornered by consequence. He claimed he had been acting out of fiduciary responsibility. He claimed he had advised caution, and that the company's PR had moved faster than proof.
The company placed him on administrative leave while the audit completed. The leave felt like a signal. Institutions will sometimes sacrifice a middle manager to keep the edifice intact. Later, the audit would find procedural violations, and Tyler would face internal discipline up to and including termination. The story the audit released did not paint him as a villain, so much as an agent in a system that rewarded safe optics over messy humanity. Bernard watched a company rearrange itself in response to a man's life. He felt complicated gratitude. He felt embarrassed by the attention and angry at the damage that had been inflicted.
He also felt the immense practical relief of a rent check in his bank, of keys to a small, clean apartment Alexandra had arranged through a local housing partner. The unit was modest and honest: a table, a lamp, a narrow bookshelf where Molly could keep stuffed animals. It felt like an embassy to a life trying to restore dignity. Janet moved with them, a practical redeemer. She had been a witness to many lives and had the kind of stamina that made neighbors trust her. She became, in short order, the family's anchor in their new place, organizing utilities, meeting the social worker, arguing with a leasing agent in the kind of language people learn when they refuse to be dismissed. Yet the city's rumor mill continued to grind. The blog that had posted the sealed pages did not vanish overnight. It had provoked a conversation in corners of the internet that fed on spectacle. A few outlets that thrived on outrage republished the same claims with hedges, and a cable commentator, one who trafficked in the theater of scandal, spoke about privileged cover-ups. The spike in chatter was measurable. It would be measurable again tomorrow. Alexandra chose another tack. She stepped into public square with more than a press release. She stepped forward to accept responsibility. She released a longer statement that acknowledged the company's initial mishandling of the situation and promised change. It was not a PR speak apology. It had specific actions attached: the creation of an employee welfare fund, a paid leave policy for workers injured or traumatized on the job, mandatory sensitivity and bystander training for both contractors and executives, and an independent ombudsman to oversee future disputes. Bernard read the statement in the small living room, his daughter in his lap. He felt exposed. The thought of being the public face of a program made him squirm. He had always cleaned rooms rather than chaired meetings. He had always been the kind of person who wanted to do quiet things for his child and not be a spectacle. "You don't have to be the poster man," Alexandra said when she came up to visit. She was answering a question she had not been asked. She had arranged for a private meeting in a community center with coffee and a small circle of people who would be affected by the proposed welfare program.
"But I want you to help design it. I don't want to impose a program on people like you. I want us to build it together." His first reaction was reflexive, pride mixed with a stubborn aversion to charity. "I don't want to be used," he said quietly. His mouth had been taught to hold words like a shield. "You won't be used," she said. "You'll have decision power. You'll help decide who gets help, what help looks like. This isn't charity from the top. It's a program that will be shaped by people who've had to scrape to live." She slid across a folder that contained a draft outline: emergency grants, a rent buffer that could be accessed with a streamlined application, training funds for contractors, a confidential hotline, and a fund for legal defense when sealed records were misused by third parties. It was pragmatic. It was small and courageous in the way that bureaucracies seldom are. She wanted the program to be administered by people with lived experience, not only by consultants. Bernard's face changed. He listened as if the words were tools he might someday pick up. He was wary of the spotlight. He was wary of becoming a token. But he had something deeper, a sense of responsibility he had cultivated by caring for Molly alone when many other men in his neighborhood did not shoulder that duty. He had the hands of a man who fixed things, who put things in order. Designing a program was a kind of fixing. He said yes, but with conditions. He asked for a seat at the table, not a plaque behind glass. He insisted that the program be transparent, and that decisions be audited by an independent community advisory board that included renters, hourly workers, and a representative of the Legal Aid Society. Alexandra agreed to all of it, and then she did something more. She agreed that Bernard would be paid for his time as an advisor, that he would have a title and a role that would not subordinate his voice, but amplify it. The decision rippled. PR looked for sound bites. Journalists wanted the human interest line. The janitor who saved the CEO now helps the company take care of its people. Some versions flattened the complexity into neat sugar-coated narratives. Others asked sharp questions about performative reform. Alexandra expected both. She expected the push and the pull. She had the resources to ride both. Tyler, meanwhile, watched his professional life narrow. He had been the face of caution. He became, gradually, the emblem of an earlier choice that had misfired. His administrative leave was followed by a review that highlighted pattern of behavior issues: a tendency to prioritize investor narrative over employee welfare, a reliance on defensive tactics that had hampered the company's reputation in the long term. Executives debated his fate in rooms where quarterly earnings charts hung like epigraphs. Tyler argued he had been following protocol. The company argued that protocol should have included a deeper human lens.
The result, after weeks of suspended conference calls and a terse memo, was a parting that was frank and quietly brutal. Tyler was let go with a non-disparagement agreement and an exit package. He left the building the same way thousands of corporate lives do, polite, with a cardboard box in his arms and a sense that the system had preserved itself by making small sacrifices.
It was not a melodramatic firing so much as a structural correction. The measure was more about the company's governance than individual villainy. The point the reporters tended to miss was this: systems reward certain blind spots until they don't. A man's removal from a role does not by itself fix anything. What mattered now was the program being built and whether it could hold. In the weeks that followed, the program, named by the marketing team with a moderate amount of distaste but ultimately left to the community board, came alive in small, concrete ways. They piloted a simple emergency stipend that could be accessed within 24 hours for workers who faced sudden loss of income. They created a legal hotline to protect those with sealed records from opportunistic leaks, fund immediate housing relief, and offer mental health counseling without the stipulation of corporate gatekeeping. A small team of social workers was hired. A partnership with a community housing nonprofit meant that families like Bernard's could move from temporary apartments into subsidized units with stability built in. An internal dashboard tracked usage and outcomes. It was transparent to the advisory board and to a dedicated ombudsman whose job was to listen and to amplify complaints. Bernard threw himself into the work with a practical zeal. He would not call it politics, he called it necessary. He would meet contractors, speak with hourly employees, hold listening sessions in break rooms and church halls. He listened for patterns. He listened for the detail of shame and the architecture of barriers. He argued that a program had to be easy to access and low on paperwork. He had seen, in his own life, how complicated forms and long waits could be as devastating as the initial injury. He pushed for a fast lane application for eviction threats and for confidentiality protections that would prevent a person's story from becoming public without consent. There were moments of tension. Executives worried about costs, board members worried about precedent, PR worried about optics. But Alexandra was there, not to shape the message so much as to use her platform to hold a standard. This wound needed mending that would not humiliate the healed. She was criticized for being too public with her mea culpa, and praised by others for the same reason. The company's stock wavered and then steadied. Investors who had initially hissed at the visible generosity recognized that reputational risk had shifted toward long-term stability rather than short-term spin. The smear machinery never fully quieted.
The initial blog still existed, hungry, but the legal notices and the company's transparent release of footage closed many of the more dangerous holes. More importantly, the lives of the people the company touched, janitors, contracted workers, building attendants, began to change. The first month the fund paid out rent supplements to 24 families. The legal hotline fielded 60 calls in its second month. Calls about eviction threats, calls about leaked records, calls about wage theft. People who had once thought they had no recourse found a way to be heard. Molly noticed the slow change in small increments. She began to sleep in a room that had its own corner and a bookshelf. She went to a new school where her teacher introduced class projects about civic duty and listening. At the school's winter recital, she tugged her father's sleeve and pointed to the stage where he'd been asked to stand briefly in a moment of recognition. He stepped off again quickly, embarrassed, but a neighbor filmed the moment and uploaded a clip where his small, proud smile warmed like a pocket lamp. The narrative of rescue and repair reached a hinge when the company held a public forum, a town hall-style event, where the program would be formally announced and where Bernard, at Alexandra's insistence, would speak. The event was held in a converted warehouse near the river, a space with warm lighting and rows of chairs filled with staff and community members. Cameras recorded, journalists lined the back. The program's first metrics hung on a screen: emergency grants issued, number of counseling sessions scheduled, a simplified application turnaround time. At the podium, Bernard felt a friction between fear and necessity. He had rehearsed little and did not want to be a story. He wanted to give others resources to not be erased. He thought of all the times he had been invisible, the small indignities that gather like dust, and he thought of Molly's laughter. He thought of Janet's steady hands. He leaned toward the microphone and began. "They think I did something wrong," he said simply, voice rough from use. There was a ripple, some sympathetic noise, a cough, a camera click. He continued, "I touched a woman's face to save her life. Then I was told I had been wrong, that I had crossed some line I didn't know existed. I was scared for me, yes, but I was more scared for Molly. I was scared that the things I did to survive would be used to take away what I built for her." He paused and looked at the crowd. He kept his chin low. His words were not oblique. "What we're doing now is not about me," he said. "It's about making sure that no one else has to choose between keeping their rent and protecting a child. It's about making sure that when someone does the right thing, they aren't punished because someone else in a room decides a story is easier than a fact." Alexandra stood to his right, hands folded in a way that suggested both contrition and resolve.
When he finished, one of the first to clap was Janet. The applause spread, modest but real. After the town hall, the metrics they released were careful and human-centric rather than boasting. In the first 3 months, 320 employees and contracted workers had accessed emergency aid. 180 legal consultations had been funded.
3 management personnel had been reassigned, pending sensitivity training, after complaints about optics language in emergency responses. Turnover in the facilities department decreased, and the independent ombudsman published an early report on access barriers and promising fixes. Numbers were not a panacea, but they were evidence of movement. There were dissenters. Some said the company had overreached, others said Bernard had been exploited for a PR story. Some accused Alexandra of using her philanthropy to pivot the firm's image. Bernard heard the critiques and felt for the first time how complicated visibility could be. He had been made visible, and that visibility could be a shelter or a target. He had to negotiate the terrain with care. In private, Alexandra told him something she had not said before in public. Power is not merely permission, she said. It's a responsibility to use what you can for repair. That doesn't absolve us from scrutiny, but it does ask us to choose to act. Bernard nodded. He did not feel absolved on either side. He felt the slow recalibration of life. He felt like someone whose boat had been damaged in a storm, and who was now, with the help of others, patching it and learning how to row in a different sea. Tyler's departure rippled in the corridors of the company for weeks. He moved into another job months later, one with less direct influence, and there were opinion pieces wondering if corporate culture had simply shifted. Some of Tyler's defenders argued that he had been scapegoated. Others argued that institutions needed leaders who would not shrink from human costs. The company instituted new governance, mandatory cross-functional ethics reviews for sensitive incidents, a privacy officer tasked to ensure sealed records stayed sealed in practical ways, and a rapid response team that prioritized human welfare before framing. Bernard's life steadied in ways that mattered. He took a part-time coordinator position with the employee welfare team. It paid more than his janitor job and provided a schedule that allowed him to be with Molly at nights. He complained to Alexandra the first time she offered it, in the way a man complains when being given something large and not wanting it to be charity. "I don't want to be some figurehead," he said. "You won't be," Alexandra replied. "You'll be paid. You'll have veto power on spending. You'll tell me when we're wrong." He accepted on the condition that they measured outcomes and that a community board could review case decisions. He asked that the names of people who sought help remain confidential.
He insisted that the program's administrators be people who had experience with real precarity. Cooks, caregivers, custodians, people who understood that forms and waiting lists can kill just as surely as lack of medicine. The moral center of the program was not Alexandra's money alone, but the man in the chair who had survived his life's bruises by doing what had to be done. He understood the mechanics of survival. He was also stubbornly human. At home, the rhythms returned. They were not the same rhythms as before. There was more attention and more quiet confidence in small things. Molly had a regular bedtime and a new teacher who called her bright and then meant it. Janet kept knitting, but now also helped others file forms for the fund. She had become unofficially the neighborhood liaison. She liked that the company had finally placed a small office nearby to process claims, a place with a friendly face and a slow fan where people who had been invisible could step in and ask for help without fearing that their private lives would be traded for headlines. The community noticed. Small local contractors who had once been hesitant to take on work from the firm were invited to meetings. A few of them found opportunities for steady gigs. The ripple did not erase decades of structural inequality, but it opened cracks where empathy and policy could enter. There were inevitably limits. Not every story healed. Not everyone who sought aid got it right away. The bureaucracy sometimes misfired. Conversations around sealed records and privacy continued in formal settings and in coffee shops. Bernard remained vigilant about his own privacy, about the privacy of others, and about the temptation to let one's story be used as a talisman. He refused to be the program's only face. He wanted other stories to populate the work. Publicly, his speech at the town hall became a modest moment of vindication. It did not erase the humiliation he had faced, but it did shift the narrative from accusation to repair. He continued to tell his truth in measured ways. He sometimes said, with the bluntness that had been honed by life, "Don't make me into a hero. Let me be a man who got to help others." People respected that. Months later, in an internal report presented to the board, the welfare program's early numbers were framed as an outline for expansion, a blueprint other companies might adopt. Alexandra spoke at a conference about leadership and responsibility, quoting the phrase she had heard years ago, "Power without responsibility is an illusion." She added a new line, "Visibility is not a weapon to be wielded, it's an accountability to be practiced." Bernard went with her to that conference, and the two of them shared a panel. He spoke about practicalities, how to make applications simple, how to make legal aid quick, how to build funds so they do not require a person to lose everything before help arrives.
He spoke about dignity, about the quiet terror of wondering whether the cost of one small act would be your child's home. He told the story plainly. No theatrics, no invocation, just the truth. Outside the conference center, a young man in a maintenance uniform came up to Bernard with hands calloused like his own. "You saved somebody," the man said, "and then you helped us. Thank you." Bernard's face folded into the kind of smile that had nothing performative about it. "You're not invisible anymore," he said to the man. The phrase had circulated. Alexandra had spoken it first, but it had become an ethic they both believed in. It had become something to aim toward. The work that followed was slow and practical. The company's independent ombudsman tracked complaints and saw fewer cases where workers were punished for doing their jobs. The advisory board recommended that other firms adopt similar funds. A handful did. A few journalists wrote skeptical pieces and then followed up with more nuanced profiles. The internet continued to be a wild and messy place, but the company's willingness to be transparent with the footage and the facts had deflated some of the more voracious rumor engines. In the quiet that returned to his life, Bernard grew less afraid of phone notifications. He still woke in the middle of the night sometimes, listening to the small clock that kept the apartment's rhythm, but those moments became less frequent. He and Molly learned a small ritual. Every night before bed they walked to the window and watched the lights of the city. "We're okay," he would say, not as a prophecy, but as a present fact. Molly would nod, braids bobbing. On a late afternoon, months after the crash and the viral posts and the memos and the panels, Bernard took Molly to the balcony of their modest apartment. The sky was a long smear of pink. They sat on plastic chairs, their knees bumping. Behind them, Janet hummed a hymn in the kitchen, something old and small, and the sound threaded through the room like mending thread. "Do you remember when you taught me CPR?" Molly asked, twisting the rabbit's ear. "I remember," he said. "You wanted to practice on everything in the house." Molly giggled. "I didn't know you'd have to practice on a lady boss," she said. And then she sobered. "Are they nice to you now?" "They're trying to be," he said. He looked at the skyline. He thought of the boardroom, of the flash of an incident misread, of the machinery that had nearly crushed him. He thought of the odd kindness of being given a seat at the table and of having to decide how best to use it. A small woman's hand found his. It was sticky from the sugar of an after-school snack. "I like our new home," she said. "We have books now." He laughed. "Yeah," he said. "We do." The program he helped shape had already helped hundreds. It would grow, falter, be reworked. People would argue about its structure for years.
But in that moment, on a balcony with his daughter at his side, the immediate practical outcomes mattered more than policy debates. He had a place to sleep. He had a job that paid him for his insight. He had a community that kept asking not only what could be salvaged, but how to prevent harm from starting in the first place. Alexandra's life did not become saintly. She continued to be a leader of a large enterprise, subject to market forces and shareholder pressures and the awkward geometry of running a company. But she changed too. She walked the building she had once only passed by, listened in small ways she once had not, and carried a sense that being visible meant being accountable in ways that had more teeth than any press release ever would. There were no neat Hollywood endings. There was work and tedium and bureaucratic back and forth, and the reality that change takes time. But there was also repair. There were numbers and audits and metrics that proved, in the limited language of spreadsheets, that people were better off than before. There were houses with keys and children with books, and an advisory board that met monthly to ensure that the fund put people before optics. There was, slowly, a new culture in a corporation that had been willing to face its own failure and to do more than say sorry. One evening, as a thin wane began, Bernard stood at a community meeting and listened to others tell stories similar to his, stories of being misread or punished for proximity. They spoke softly, the way people do when they are trying not to be heard but need to be. He rose to speak, and when he did not seek applause. He sought clarity. He said plainly, help is not charity when it restores someone's dignity. Months later, in a small profile about the program, a journalist asked him what he wanted people to remember about the whole ordeal. He thought for a long time and then said that a life saved is not a currency to be cashed in on. That when we make mistakes, big institutions, small towns, private people, repair is not about optics. It's about doing what's hard, giving people a real chance to live. Molly, listening in the adjoining room, said it differently. Dad fixed things, she said, beaming. He fixed things. Not every scar disappeared. Not every rumor went quiet.
But a man who once feared that a single frame could destroy him had, in the end, a seat at a table where the decisions were being made differently. He had a role that honored his experience and allowed him to change systems instead of merely surviving them. He had, as Alexandra had promised, been made visible. On the balcony one crisp evening, he turned to Alexandra when she visited them in the small apartment and said, with a quiet clarity he had not always known he possessed, "You were right to come. People need someone to be accountable when things go wrong." Her reply was short, steady, "And you were right to say yes."
He looked at his daughter, the city's soft light on her hair. He felt the small breath of satisfaction that comes from seeing a life stabilize, not because an act of grace had been tokenized on a headline, but because practical, structural repair had been made possible by people who chose work over performance. That was the truth that outlasted the initial fury of the rumor. That was the repair that mattered. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that ordinary people can spark extraordinary change. And subscribe for more stories about people whose quiet courage reshapes bigger systems.